Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Kari and today I am doing my beginning of December wrap-up and end of December TBR. If you'll recall, I switched states a couple of days ago, and so I have a whole new collection of books, as you can see, that are here with me now, so I will be reading several from this nice section of books. However, I also have about 6 or 7 that I read while I was still not here. So we'll jump right into those. First one is Dear Martin by Nick Stone. This follows a young black man as he realizes the problems that face the United States as a society regarding racism, specifically regarding all of the shootings that have occurred in the last couple of years. I really enjoyed this book. It's a pretty short book. I read it in a night, and it really brought home what's going on in a very simple, personal way. The next book I read was The Bully Book by Eric Congale. As I've said before, this book was on my TBR simply because he is a Star Kid and I love that group. This book actually is a really genuine way of portraying the bullies versus the bullied. It follows the bully book for half of it, and then alternates with the person who is being bullied, or the grunt, through his 6th grade experience as the grunt tries to figure out why he's the grunt and what that even means. Next one I finished was The Siege by Ismail Kadare. This one is sort of a historical fiction. The author doesn't consider it a historical fiction apparently, which is what it says in the acknowledgements at the end of the book. This one follows basically the Ottoman army in about the 1500s as they try to take Albania, or one specific fortress in Albania. It doesn't go very well, spoiler alert, but it follows the Ottoman army as they try various different ways to get into the fortress and what the people in the fortress think about the Ottoman army camped outside their fortress and how they react to it. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was just a very different take on what you see as a siege. Typically you see them sort of glorified, you see the heads being thrown over or the dead cattle because we're gonna win by biological warfare, but this took it down to sort of a more minute level and made it so that you don't glorify it. The next one was Lord of Shadows by Cassandra Clare. I did not enjoy this book so much. I'm just kind of sick of Cassandra Clare's writing. People don't die properly, and the forbidden love story is very, very old to me. So this one was not high on my list. But this one follows Emma and Julian as they, again, try to save the Institute or the world, whichever comes first, and try to figure out life at the same time. The next one I read on my Kindle, which was technically my phone because my Kindle is somewhere in my apartment. And this one is by Elizabeth May. This one follows a young girl who finds out her destiny is to kill fairies, or the fae. Another sort of old story for me. I'm really looking for original ideas at this point, or at least a decent retelling of the same ideas, and this one just didn't cut it for me. She has to save Edinburgh, Scotland. I did enjoy the Scottish setting, specifically in Edinburgh, but it didn't feel Scottish. Every once in a while they would throw in words like we or lad or bairn, but that doesn't do anything for me. Lander, on the other hand, has an absolutely phenomenal Scottish setting that really takes you there. The Falconer just didn't. This one I read was The Power by Naomi Alderman. I read this one for Our Shared Shelf, started by Emma Watson. It's the book for November and December. I did not expect to like this one at all because it sounded more dystopian and just repetitive, basically, but I loved this book. It's an alternate history, but in a different way than at least I thought of it. When people said alternate history, I thought, oh, okay, we've started over and basically rewritten all of history that we know with the same people, but it's not that. By alternate history, at least the way I think of it after this book, we've gotten up to this point, to the 2000s, with all this technology, and then suddenly, because of some chemical we leaked in World War II, women, specifically these 14, 15-year-old girls, have been developing a scheme, which is along their collarbone, and that's where they get this power to electrify people, or electrocute rather. This power that they have now, they can awaken in older women, and it scares the crap out of the men. You see some men who really try to take advantage of it in the story. You see other men who just cannot cope with the fact that women can deal with all of these problems and they don't have to act the way men expect them to act anymore. And so throughout the book you see it as the men try to cope with it and the women try to figure it out, and how everything just blows up in everybody's faces. And that's when history restarts. So you go back to the Stone Age and start again with women in the position that we think of as a masculine position. I hope that made sense, because it does in my head, but my head doesn't always translate properly when it comes to speaking. Last book I read before I switched states is What Lies Between Us by Naomi Munaweera. And this book was also kind of a bit of a surprise. I joined Joss over at Scribbles Reads book club on Goodreads because she reads a lot of the more marginalized authors, which I would like to read because I don't know a lot of them. I don't necessarily know how to find them, so her book club is a good place to start. I will link her channel down below if you are interested. This book follows a Sri Lankan girl from her childhood up until through her adulthood, and she sort of has to come to grips with Sri Lankan culture, which is perfectly normal to her, but then they immigrate to the States after a rather traumatic event, and then she has to completely reintegrate herself and figure out what it means. There is definitely, at the very least, there's sexual assault in this book. There's just a lot of cultural differences, and it is a little bit of a hard book to read, but I think it portrayed motherhood in a very interesting and refreshing light. It didn't say automatically every woman wants a baby, every woman will have that maternal instinct, and you know, you're a perfect mother. It portrayed it in a more realistic light, which I loved. So, now that the beginning of December is out of the way, let's get to my rather ambitious TBR for the rest of December, shall we? So I'm currently reading one of the books I started in November, which is The Covenant by James Michener. This follows South Africa, basically from start to finish. I am 500 pages into this book out of 1200, and I'm actually really enjoying it. He kind of brings in, even when we were looking at the beginning, when the Xhosa were just starting to build up their empire, he brought in later historians with quotes that ran along the lines of, in 19 whatever, this certain historian would say XYZ about the Xhosa. I really find that an interesting way of writing, and it's not something I've seen before. I also want to read All the Gallant Men by Don Stratton. This is the only Pearl Harbor memoir or autobiography by an Arizona survivor. He was on the USS Arizona when Pearl was hit. He had burns over, I think, 60% of his body, if I remember correctly, and I have been absolutely dying to read this book. So that is very high on my TBR. Now the next ones I basically don't know much of the plot because I bought them a while ago and I've just had them on my shelf waiting for me to read them. So synopsis are non-existent. First one is Seraphina and the Black Cloak by Robert Beatty. I remember seeing a book trailer for this one, which was the first book trailer I ever saw. I didn't know they did that, but they do. And it just sounds really interesting to me. It's middle grade or YA, I'm not entirely sure, but it sounded interesting at the time, and I've had it for probably 2 years. Is Ink and Bone by Rachel Kane. Again, had it for a couple years. It sounded really good. It has something to do with a library, and as somebody who absolutely loves books, how could I say no? I also want to read Flamecaster by Cinda Williams Chima. This book is a Shattered Realms novel, and I have, I think, all except Shadowcaster of the rest of her books. So I do really want to read this because I enjoy her writing. I just don't remember what this one is about. The next 3 are part of a series I already own the rest of. It's about a 10-book series, and that is the Temeraire series by Naomi Novik. So I have to read Crucible of Gold, Blood of Tyrants, and League of Dragons. Last I remember, they had come back from their exile in Australia. It's also been a while since I've read this series, but I loved it. The dragons are so interesting and just beautifully described. So I'm very excited to finally finish this series. I also want to read The Ambassador's Daughter by Pam Jenoff. I really enjoy Pam Jenoff's writing. I've read The Winter's Guest and The Diplomat's Wife by her, both of which I thoroughly enjoyed. The Winter Guest a little bit more than The Diplomat's Wife. I bought this one basically because of the author. From the title it looks like 1930s Paris, maybe 1940s, but that's all I got. Then the last book, we're just going to completely switch genres with this one too. This one is a non-fiction. It's called The Secret Knowledge of Water by Craig Childs. I'm quite excited to read this one as well. I sort of got into this mood about a year back where I wanted to read more non-fiction. I wanted to read more about the environment and the animals, and this book just seemed very interesting and sort of depicted how water has shaped where we live and everything that goes along with that, since we need it to, you know, survive. But that's all I got about this book. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up down below, and if you want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button down below. As always, I will leave my Goodreads in the down bar if you want to check out what I read. Those are all the books I have read and want to read in the month of December, so I will see you soon with another video. Bye!